Hi, I'm Melba Pearson, also known as the Resident Legal Diva, and welcome to Melba Make It Make Sense. So, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to my channel as we dive into all things that touch on law in our societies. Today's topic, cannabis, guns, and the law. So recently, a viewer put in one of the comments that, "Oh, how cute! You got your bong in the back, ha ha ha." No, it's actually a glass vase, for real, for real. And it made me laugh because I thought that was funny. But it made me think of a deeper question: if cannabis is legal in your state, how come you still can't legally own a gun if you're a user? I'm going to break it down in the meantime. So, first off, here's the state of play: 24 states plus Washington, D.C. allows for recreational cannabis. About 39 states allow for medical cannabis. However, at the federal level, cannabis is still classified as a controlled substance, which means under federal law, someone who is an unlawful user of a controlled substance is barred from owning and possessing firearms. So you can see that there's a tension here, right? It's legal with the state, but illegal federally. So what's up with that? So here's the case that's going to go before the Supreme Court. This is the case of U.S. versus Hemani. This is a man out of Texas, Ali Daniel Hemani, who was found with a Glock and about 2 ounces of cannabis and about close to 5 grams of coke in his home. So he was charged under a law and that's 18 U.S.C. section 922, subsection G, subsection 3, in case you really want to go policy wonk on this, but it prohibits firearm possession by anyone who is an unlawful user of or addicted to any controlled substance. If it sounds familiar, that's the same law that Hunter Biden was convicted of before his father, President Biden, pardoned him. And this is commonly known as failing to disclose habitual drug use when purchasing a firearm. So, the Fifth Circuit held that, as applied to the person in this case, Hemani, the statute was unconstitutional because the government hasn't shown that a across-the-board ban is consistent with the historical tradition of the regulation of firearms as required under the Supreme Court's recent case, which is New York State NRA, basically, versus Brune. So basically, not to get too in the weeds here, but basically what they're saying is that a recent court case out of New York was basically saying that you can't have an across-the-board ban on firearms unless it's really, really the public safety. So I'm really distilling it down, but that's some in substance of what it is. So why is it okay for a person in a legal cannabis state to use cannabis, but they can't own or use a gun? So it seems like super, contradiction, especially since, it's both. So think of it this way. If you drink whiskey, right? You hang out, you go have a nice whiskey neat sitting on your porch, whatever. You're allowed to have a gun in your house, right? You just can't be drunk and using it and threatening people, but you can literally have a cocktail at your house with a gun in your house, right? Not an issue. But for a cannabis user, even if you're not currently under the influence, the fact that you use cannabis means that you can't own that gun. So let's think about this from the perspective of the Second Amendment and fairness. So why is alcohol being treated differently? Why is cannabis penalized if both affect behavior and your awareness, your cognitive state, and both are legal in many states? So make that make sense, right? So you've got federal law saying you can't do it. You've got state level law that says, yes, you can have cannabis and use cannabis, and yes, you can have a firearm, but the feds say you can't have both, right? Broom, that I mentioned earlier, that the Supreme Court's going to have to use to kind of in what to do here. The Supreme Court in that case said that gun regulations have to be consistent with the nation's historical tradition of firearm regulation. So The question is, number one, does the Second Amendment cover the person's conduct, Hemani's conduct here? And two, is the restriction consistent with historical tradition? So a couple other courts have been like, kind of to the feds having this blanket ban of if you use cannabis, you can't have a gun, right? So for instance, the 11th Circuit in a medical marijuana case held that the government failed to show the ban was consistent with historical tradition. So what will the Supreme Court say? That is the question. So if the Supreme Court upholds the federal law, it means that states legalizing cannabis won't override the ban on being able to own a gun. So people in legal cannabis states are unable to purchase or possess firearms if they are users. And that can also employ to employers, security personnel, dispensary workers are blocked from gun ownership if they use. But on the other hand, if the court strikes it down, we can end up seeing more gun owners who use cannabis legally, pressure on Congress to revise the gun ban, the state law mismatch becoming more problematic. So now you have more states that have to kind of policy, and also impacts for medical marijuana patients. And, is that all going to mean, right? And also, to me, it's leveling the playing field. And it could put more pressure on Congress to legalize cannabis nationally. So that way you don't have this kind of disparate enforcement where some states say this and some states say that, and you can have a gun under this circumstance, but you can't have a gun under a very similar circumstance. End of story, right? So let's look at this from the constitutional perspective, right? So all manner of folks, conservative, liberal, progressive, libertarian, whatever, use cannabis, and people also drink too, right? So having this inconsistency is not a matter of party or, rural or anything like that. Listen, if neither of the two folks, one who's using cannabis and one who's drinking, is under the influence while handling the gun, so what's justification for the difference, right? Consistency. So this doesn't make sense to me. And also too, think about other drugs like NyQuil, right? Available over the counter. Xanax, prescribed to you by your doctor. You can get them legally, but if you take too much, and let's say you fall asleep at the wheel because scenario, you're coming home from work, you have a massive cold, you decide to stop at the pharmacy, get you some NyQuil, you chug some in the parking lot because you're like, as soon as I get home, I'm going to sleep good, right? Yeah, but you end up falling asleep behind the wheel of the car as you're driving before you make it home. Guess what? That's illegal. That's a problem, right? Same thing if you were drunk. You could get arrested for being impaired and operating a car. Same thing if you were high on cannabis. So the underline here is that you are liable if you are under the influence of any of those substances and you harm someone. The same application has to do with guns. If you are drunk, if you are under the influence of NyQuil, Xanax, whatever, and you have the gun and you use it and you harm someone, there's already laws for that. You are criminally liable. But if you're not impaired and you have it in your house, then what's the difference? Is it constitutional to take people's guns away based on use rather than actually being impaired and using a gun? Because to me, that's way more problematic than you having it in your house and you're not even remotely touching it, but you're having a drink on your couch or on your porch or whatever the case may be. And the same thing, you're having a joint on your couch, on your balcony, whatever, right? How is that different? And then let's add another layer. The ACLU, American Civil Liberties Union, found that Black and white people have similar rates of cannabis use, yet Black people are 4 times more likely to be arrested. So that means the gun prohibition on cannabis users may disproportionately affect Black Americans who legally use cannabis in their state. And so now we're looking at civil rights concerns. How is this fair? So what's next? We're going to be seeing this case get heard and discussed more robustly in about the early part of 2026. Probably have a decision by the summer of 2026. What is this going to mean for federal agencies? Are they going to have to revise their rules? What's Congress going to do? And are states going to revise their laws? Lots of questions there. So at the end of the day, while that whole little mistake over the vase made me laugh, it also highlights how underexamined some legal disparities are. And the Supreme Court is about to decide whether or not that makes constitutional sense. So whether you favor cannabis, gun rights, both or neither, one thing we should all support is a level playing field, equal treatment under the law. Sound off under the comments. Let me know what you think. Where do you stand on cannabis? Where do you stand on guns? Is any of this fair? And leave your thoughts, because I'll be checking it out. And thanks for watching. I hope I made sense. Make sure to like, comment, and ring that bell. Take care. Diva out. Bye.